The first thing my wife said when we entered divorce court was something I never expected to hear from the woman I'd spent most of my adult life loving. "Your Honor, my husband is nothing more than a washed-up old Marine." Her words landed harder than any punch I'd taken in uniform. The courtroom went completely still. I looked at her. Linda, 32 years of marriage, sitting across from me in a tailored blue jacket. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she hadn't just reduced our entire life together to a single cruel sentence. She didn't look at me. Maybe she couldn't. Then I looked toward the judge. He was an older man with silver hair and reading glasses balanced near the end of his nose. He had been reaching for a cup of coffee when my wife spoke. I had seen him before. Not recently. Not in a courtroom. But somewhere much darker. Somewhere with rain coming down so hard it felt like the sky itself was collapsing. I studied his face for several seconds. Then I quietly said, "Judge Morgan, do you remember me?" His hand stopped. The coffee cup remained suspended halfway between the desk and his mouth. He stared at me. At first, there was only confusion. Then recognition. His eyes widened. The color drained from his face. And when he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Frank." I nodded. Judge Harold Morgan slowly stood. "Frank Dalton." My wife's attorney suddenly stopped shuffling his papers. Linda turned toward the bench. The judge took one step backward. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he whispered the words that changed everything. "Oh, my God." I watched him carefully. 24 years, I said. Morgan's expression changed. He wasn't looking at an old man sitting in a divorce courtroom anymore. He was looking at someone from another life. A younger man. A Marine. A storm. A rescue. A night neither of us had ever forgotten. Judge Morgan finally sat down. Then he looked toward the bailiff. "We're taking a recess." My wife's attorney immediately stood. "Your Honor." 15 minutes, Morgan said firmly. The gavel came down. And just like that, the courtroom emptied around me. Linda remained seated. She stared at me as if I'd suddenly become a stranger. Maybe, after 32 years, I was. Because the man she thought she knew was only part of the story. And to understand why Judge Harold Morgan looked at me that way, you have to understand where I came from. I grew up in eastern North Carolina. In my hometown, the Marine Corps wasn't just an institution. It was part of the landscape. My father had served in Korea. My older brother never came home from Vietnam. By the time I finished school, I didn't really think of joining the Marines as a choice. It felt like something I was supposed to do. So I enlisted. And I stayed. 26 years. I learned how to carry heavy things without showing that they were heavy. That's what military service teaches you sometimes. You learn to keep moving. You learn not to complain. You learn to put the mission first. And if something inside you breaks, you learn to hide it. I met Linda in 1989. It was at a church fundraiser in Wilmington. I made a terrible joke about the barbecue. She laughed anyway. That was the beginning. Back then, Linda didn't care about money. She didn't care about appearances. I drove an old pickup with rust around the wheel arches. My dress uniform had seen better days. But she told me something I'll never forget. "You make me feel safe." 4 years, that was enough. We bought a small house. We had our son, Michael. We argued about bills. We watched television after dinner. We complained about the weather. We lived an ordinary life. And ordinary life, I eventually learned, can be the most precious thing in the world. But then I retired. And retirement wasn't what I expected. I thought I would finally relax. Instead, the things I'd spent decades keeping locked away started coming back. The nightmares became more frequent. Crowded places made me uncomfortable. Sometimes I'd sit in my truck outside a shop for 10 minutes before I could convince myself to go inside. I didn't know how to explain it. Linda didn't know how to understand it. And I didn't blame her. Not entirely. I simply didn't have the words. So I became quieter. She became frustrated. And slowly, almost invisibly, we began moving in opposite directions. Linda made new friends through her real estate work. People with bigger houses, more expensive cars, more glamorous holidays. At first, I ignored it. Then the comments began. Why don't you replace that old truck? Why do you still wear that jacket? Why can't you be more social? Eventually, I stopped answering. And every unanswered question became another brick in the wall between us. When Michael moved away, the house became even quieter. Linda and I were still married. But sometimes marriage is only a legal word. You can sleep in the same bed and live completely separate lives. One evening, Linda asked for a divorce. She said she'd spent too many years settling. I remember looking at her across the kitchen table. I could have fought. I could have shouted. I could have demanded explanations. Instead, I nodded. All right. I didn't want the house. I didn't care about most of the furniture. I agreed to divide the savings. I even offered part of my retirement income. I thought I was being reasonable. I thought I was being kind. But I learned something painful. When someone has stopped respecting you, kindness can look like weakness. And that's how we ended up in court. Linda's lawyer wanted almost everything. The house. The savings. Property I'd inherited from my father. And during the first part of the hearing, I sat there while he described me as an emotionally distant old man who had become incapable of being a proper husband. I listened. I said nothing. Then Linda called me a worthless Marine. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I suddenly wanted revenge. I didn't. But because I looked toward Judge Morgan and saw something I hadn't expected. Recognition. After the recess was called, Linda finally approached me. What is going on? I shrugged. Nothing. You know that judge? Not exactly. Her attorney stepped closer. Mr. Dalton, are you suggesting you have some prior relationship with Judge Morgan? Not really. Technically, that was true. You don't truly know someone because you shared one night with them. But some nights stay with you forever. A few minutes later, Judge Morgan returned. He looked older than I remembered. Of course he did. 24 years had passed. But his eyes were the same. He looked toward me. Then he said, Mr. Dalton, I'd like to speak with you privately. Linda's attorney objected immediately. Morgan didn't even raise his voice. Objection noted. Then he looked at me. Come with me. I followed him through the courthouse hallway. Inside his chambers, we stood facing each other. Neither of us spoke. Then Morgan laughed softly. You got old. I smiled. You're one to talk. He shook his head. Then, unexpectedly, he walked over and hugged me. It wasn't a polite handshake. It wasn't a judge greeting someone he vaguely remembered. It was the embrace of a man who had spent 24 years remembering the person who saved his life. You saved me, he whispered. I looked away. That was a long time ago. Not to me. He walked back to his desk. I noticed something sitting beside his legal files. A small wooden box. Morgan opened it. Inside was a Marine Corps Challenge coin. My coin. I stared at it. I gave you that? I asked. After they pulled us out. I shook my head. I'd forgotten. I didn't. And suddenly, I was back there. September 2002. Hurricane Isabel. The Carolina coast had become a disaster zone. Roads disappeared beneath floodwater. Vehicles were swept away. Families were trapped in homes. Emergency calls came in faster than anyone could answer them. I was a gunnery sergeant overseeing part of an evacuation response. Morgan wasn't a judge then. He was a young federal prosecutor visiting the area on business. He had become stranded with several civilians when the water rose. By midnight, the streets looked like rivers. The current was powerful enough to move cars. Trees were being ripped from the ground. Our orders were simple. Wait until conditions improved. I didn't wait. Maybe I should have. Maybe I was reckless. But I knew people were out there. So I took 2 Marines and a rescue boat into the flood. The rain was coming sideways. The darkness was almost complete. And the electrical wires overhead made every second more dangerous. Then we saw them. Morgan was holding onto a street sign. Beside him was an elderly woman. He had one arm wrapped around her while fighting to keep himself above the water. I shouted at him, "Let her go so we can get you out." He yelled back, "Not without her." That was the first moment I understood what kind of man Harold Morgan was. We pulled the woman into the boat. Then we reached for Morgan. A wave slammed into us. The boat nearly overturned. I grabbed Morgan. Something tore in my shoulder. But I didn't let go. Eventually, we made it back. Everyone survived. Morgan survived. The woman survived. And the next morning, I gave him my challenge coin. I told him something I barely remembered saying. If you get another chance at life, do something good with it. Apparently, he remembered. Because sitting across from me 24 years later, he said, "I've tried." I smiled. "I can tell." Morgan leaned back. Then his expression became serious. "What happened to you, Frank?" That was a difficult question. I could have told him about the nightmares, the loneliness, the nights I couldn't sleep, the friends I'd buried, the parts of myself that never really returned home. Instead, I gave him the simplest answer. I got tired. Morgan nodded. He understood. Then he asked me about the divorce. Had I threatened Linda? No. Had I hidden money? No. Had I abused her? Never. Morgan leaned forward. That's what I thought. Then he opened a drawer. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Some were old. Some were faded. Some had been folded so many times the paper was beginning to tear. I looked at him. What are those? People who remember you. I picked up the first. It was from a former Marine I'd helped years earlier. Another was from the widow of a serviceman. Another was from a young man who had nearly destroyed his own life. Morgan explained that he'd received letters over the years from people I'd helped. Quietly. Without asking for recognition. I had paid for someone's recovery. Helped a widow stay in her home. Talked a young Marine through the darkest night of his life. I had forgotten most of it. They hadn't. Morgan looked at me. People don't forget men who make a difference. I couldn't answer. Because I'd spent years believing I had become invisible. My wife saw an old man. My friends had moved away or died. My son had his own family. I thought maybe the world had simply moved on. But apparently, some people had been carrying pieces of my story with them. Morgan closed the folder. Frank, this divorce isn't really about money. I looked at him. What is it about? Dignity. That word stayed with me. When we returned to the courtroom, everything felt different. Linda watched me carefully. Her lawyer looked nervous. And Judge Morgan made something very clear. He would remain impartial. The case would be decided fairly. But the atmosphere had changed. Linda leaned toward me. What happened in there? Nothing. That isn't true. I looked at her. He remembered something. She stared at me. What? I didn't answer. That evening, I walked toward my truck. Then I heard her voice. Frank. I turned. Linda stood in the rain. For a moment, I saw the woman I'd married. Not the angry woman from the courtroom. Not the person who had called me worthless. Just Linda. The woman who had once danced with me in our kitchen. The woman who had held my hand at my father's funeral. The woman who had once told me I made her feel safe. She looked at me. "Who are you?" I almost laughed. But I couldn't. After 32 years, that was perhaps the saddest question she could have asked. "I'm the same man I've always been." "No," she said. "I don't think I ever really knew you." Rain began falling harder. Then she asked, "What happened with the judge?" I could have lied. Instead, I told her. I helped rescue him. Her face changed. "From what?" "A hurricane." "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at her. "Would you have listened?" She had no answer, and that silence told me everything. Then she said something unexpected. "I found a box." I knew immediately. My old military footlocker. She had found the medals, the letters, the photographs, things I had kept hidden for years. "You read them?" She nodded. "Why didn't you tell me about any of this?" I looked toward the rain. "Because I didn't think it mattered anymore." She started crying. Not loudly. Just tears running down her face. "I didn't know." "I know." And that's when I finally understood something. Sometimes people don't stop loving each other first. Sometimes they simply stop seeing each other. Then the principal introduced a special guest. Something happened that neither Linda nor I expected. I looked when I arrived at the courthouse. She smiled. Several old pickup trucks were parked to the microphone. Then I saw about service, older Marines, about sacrifice. Some walked about people who give everything. Some had and never asked to be remembered. Some had silver hair. Paused. One man I once knew a man, the entrance, who taught me that courage isn't always loud. Eddie, I knew immediately where this was going. You shouldn't have to walk into that courtroom alone. Morgan looked across the gym. Appeared. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to leave someone behind. Young Marines I'd trained. Then his eyes found I'd helped. Frank Dalton, I'd forgotten. "Would you stand?" They hadn't I forgotten shook my head. I looked around. Grabbed my hand. "What are you all doing here, Grandpa?" Eddie smiled. I stood. Standing the room applauded. "Why?" "Not because loudly. You taught us that not sometimes wildly. You show up for people." Sincerely. I shook my head. "Parents, you boys children, are making a scene. Veterans, that's the point. People who didn't know my whole courthouse together. But somehow, nobody in shouted. That moment, nobody threatened anyone. I looked toward Linda. They simply sat behind me. She was crying quietly. But this time, a row of aging veterans who had decided one of their own shouldn't face the day alone. After the ceremony, saw them. Emma walked beside me. Saw them. Grandpa, Judge Morgan saw them. Everybody knows you're a hero Linda now. Finally broke open. I smiled. The hearing resumed. Believe everything Financial documents were presented. Property values Linda came to my cabin. Then Linda's attorney returned to the subject of my military service. Something else. "Would you agree?" Inside was an old American flag from my retirement ceremony. To the failure of your marriage. I had forgotten about it. Yes. We sat on the porch in silence. "And would you agree then your Linda military said, experiences affected your ability to maintain a healthy relationship?" For stopping myself from seeing you, as if he wanted something. "And I'm sorry I stopped letting you see me of being a proper husband." Neither of us spoke for a while. He frowned. Then Emma came running onto the porch. Damage. "Grandpa, what's the difference?" "Grandma, I looked at Linda. The difference is Linda. I was hurting. She looked at me. The courtroom became silent. I said. I continued. Emma sat between us. And I didn't know how to fold it. The attorney tried to push further. Carefully. "Isn't it true that love without communication can become neglect over the marsh?" Yes. 3 generations sitting together. It can. And for the first time, then I realized Linda. Something. But that not every ending is about getting back what you lost. Linda's eyes sometimes the ending tears. Is simply learning how to live without everyone. I never got my marriage back. Her attorney Linda never became the woman she was when we first met. She stood and I never became the young Marine. You keep talking about my husband, but like he was some kind of monster. Understanding. Her voice trembled. Respect. And maybe, in the end, the attorney looked confused. Because I had spent most of my life believing strength meant carrying everything alone. She wiped her eyes. I was wrong. He wasn't
Strength
lazy.
isn't hiding your
Another
pain.
Pause.
Strength
He
isn't
wasn't
pretending
abusive.
you don't need anyone.
Then she looked
And
directly
strength
at me.
certainly isn't
He
winning
was hurting.
every battle.
Nobody
Sometimes
moved.
strength is
Linda
admitting
swallowed.
that you are hurting.
And I didn't
Sometimes
want to
it's
see
allowing
it.
someone
Her
else to
attorney
help
tried
you.
to interrupt.
And sometimes
She
the bravest
ignored
thing a
him.
person can do
I
is
spent
finally
years
tell the
comparing
truth.
our life to
The truth
everyone
about
else's.
where they've been.
She
The
spoke
truth
slowly
about
now.
what they've lost.
I wanted a
and
bigger
the truth
house,
about who
better
they still are
holidays,
beneath all the
more
years.
money.
So if
I
there's someone
started
in your
believing
life you've
I
stopped
had
seeing
married
clearly,
the wrong
don't
man.
wait until
I
you're
looked
sitting across
down.
from them in a
Somewhere
courtroom.
along the way,
Ask them
she said,
how they're doing.
I forgot who I
Listen
had actually
to the
married.
answer.
Then
Because
she
there may
reached
be a
into
story
her purse.
inside that person
She pulled
you've
out
never
a
heard.
folded piece
There
of
may be
paper.
sacrifices
I recognized
you never
it
knew about.
immediately.
There may be
An
pain they've
anniversary
carried
letter.
quietly for decades.
I'd written it years
and sometimes
earlier.
the person
I'd never
everyone
given it
overlooks
to her.
is the person
Linda
who has been holding
unfolded
everything
it.
together
What's
all along.
this?
That
I
was the
didn't
lesson
answer.
Judge Morgan
She
taught
began
me without
reading.
ever
My
intending
voice
to.
had been
That
on
was
that
the
page.
lesson my marriage
My
taught me
words.
too late.
Words I'd
and
been
maybe
too
the
afraid
greatest
to
lesson
say
of
aloud
all
is this.
I had written about
you don't
the
have
nights
to be
I
remembered
couldn't
by
sleep,
everyone.
about the
You
war
only
that
need
had
to know
followed
that
me
somewhere,
home, about how I knew
your
I
life
wasn't
mattered to
always
someone.
easy to
And
live
sometimes,
with, and
that's
about
more
how
than
none
enough.
of it had ever been her fault. At the end, I'd written something simple. I loved you before the war changed me, and I still love you now. Linda couldn't finish. Her voice broke. She lowered the letter. Why didn't you give me this? I stared at her. Because I thought it was too late. That was the truth. And sometimes the truth is more painful than any accusation. The judge finally spoke. Mrs. Dalton, are you asking the court to change your position? Linda looked at me. Then she shook her head. No. The word surprised me. She continued. I don't think we can go back. I felt something inside me settle. She was right. 32 years couldn't be repaired in a single afternoon. But then she added, I don't want to destroy him either. And that was the first kind thing she'd said about me in a very long time. The divorce was finalized several weeks later. There was no dramatic victory. No revenge. No courtroom celebration. Just paperwork. Linda kept the house. I didn't fight her. I moved into a small cabin near the coast. It wasn't much. 1 bedroom. A tiny kitchen. A porch overlooking the marsh. But something strange happened. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. I began volunteering at a veterans center. Nothing heroic. I helped people with forms, insurance, appointments, benefits. Sometimes I just listened. And I discovered something. A lot of older veterans don't need someone to fix them. They need someone willing to sit beside them. A few months later, Linda appeared at the center. She was holding coffee. The room went quiet. She looked nervous. I brought these. Nobody knew what to say. Then an old Navy veteran named Walt pointed toward an empty table. Well, don't stand there all day. A few people laughed. The tension disappeared. Linda started volunteering. Once a week. Then twice. She helped spouses fill out paperwork. She sorted donations. She listened. And slowly, something changed. Not our marriage. That was over. But something else. Respect. We began talking again. Not as husband and wife. As two people who had once loved each other and were finally learning how to see one another honestly. Our son noticed. One Sunday, Michael looked at both of us and said, I can finally have dinner with you without feeling like I'm walking through a minefield. We laughed. It was the first time we'd all laughed together in years. Then there was Emma. My granddaughter. 10 years old. Too young to understand divorce. Old enough to ask difficult questions. One afternoon, we were fishing together. She looked at me. Grandpa, were you really a hero? I nearly laughed. No. But Grandma says you saved someone. I helped someone. Isn't that the same thing? I thought about it. No.
She frowned. Then what's a hero? I looked across the water. Someone who does the right thing when nobody is watching. She considered that. Then she nodded. Okay. Children sometimes understand things adults spend decades avoiding. A few weeks later, Emma's school held a Veterans Day ceremony. She begged me to attend. Crowds still made me uncomfortable. But I couldn't say no to her. So I went. Linda came too. We sat near the back. Then the principal introduced a special guest. Judge Harold Morgan. I looked at Linda. She smiled. Morgan walked to the microphone. He spoke about service. About sacrifice. About people who give everything and never ask to be remembered. Then he paused. I once knew a man, he said, who taught me that courage isn't always loud. I knew immediately where this was going. I wanted to disappear. Morgan looked across the gym. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to leave someone behind. Then his eyes found mine. Frank Dalton, would you stand? I shook my head. Emma grabbed my hand. Come on, Grandpa. Slowly, I stood. The room applauded. Not loudly. Not wildly. But sincerely. Teachers. Parents. Children. Veterans. People who didn't know my whole story. But somehow, in that moment, they understood enough. I looked toward Linda. She was crying. But this time, I didn't see shame in her face. I saw understanding. After the ceremony, Emma walked beside me. Grandpa. Yes. Everybody knows you're a hero now. I smiled. Don't believe everything you hear. She laughed. That evening, Linda came to my cabin. She carried a small wooden box. I found something else. Inside was an old American flag from my retirement ceremony. I had forgotten about it. We sat on the porch in silence. Then Linda said, I'm sorry. I looked at her. For what? For stopping myself from seeing you. I nodded. And I'm sorry I stopped letting you see me. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then Emma came running onto the porch. Grandpa, Grandma, what are you doing? I looked at Linda. She looked at me. Folding the flag, I said. Emma sat between us. I showed her how to fold it. Triangle by triangle. Carefully. Respectfully. The sun was setting over the marsh. 3 generations sitting together. And for the first time, I realized something. Not every ending is about getting back what you lost. Sometimes the ending is simply learning how to live without bitterness. I never got my marriage back. Linda never became the woman she was when we first met. And I never became the young Marine I once was. But we found something else. Understanding. Respect. And maybe, in the end, that was enough. Because I had spent most of my life believing strength meant carrying everything alone. I was wrong. Strength isn't hiding your pain. Strength isn't pretending you don't need anyone. And strength certainly isn't winning every battle. Sometimes strength is admitting that you are hurting. Sometimes it's allowing someone else to help you. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is finally tell the truth. The truth about where they've been. The truth about what they've lost. And the truth about who they still are beneath all the years. So if there's someone in your life you've stopped seeing clearly, don't wait until you're sitting across from them in a courtroom. Ask them how they're doing. Listen to the answer. Because there may be a story inside that person you've never heard. There may be sacrifices you never knew about. There may be pain they've carried quietly for decades. And sometimes, the person everyone overlooks is the person who has been holding everything together all along. That was the lesson Judge Morgan taught me without ever intending to. That was the lesson my marriage taught me too late. And maybe the greatest lesson of all is this. You don't have to be remembered by everyone. You only need to know that somewhere, sometime, your life mattered to someone. And sometimes, that's more than enough.